I'm honoring, aren't I?
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Cyber Risk Ready. Passion and hard work. And today we're going to be talking about the effectiveness of controls, information security controls. So, are you tired of struggling to understand the effectiveness of your cybersecurity control, or even confident that your cyber control is actually doing the job that you think it is? If this is you, then this is your video. In this session, we're going to show you how to make it easier to measure your controls. Many organizations invest heavily in cybersecurity measures, but how do you know that they're actually effective? In this video, we're going to explore the key factors to consider when evaluating the effectiveness of your cybersecurity controls. So don't assume the controls are working, find out for sure. So hello and welcome to our broadcast of passion and hard work on Cyber Risk Ready. I'm your host, Tom Kraus, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my incredible co-host, Brian O'Hara. Brian brings a ton of wealth and experience in cybersecurity audit. And so we'll rely a lot on Brian's insights today for our show. So we're going to be introducing the concepts of controls. We're going to talk a little bit about those. And we're going to discuss the common misconceptions about cybersecurity controls and why having them in place isn't enough. So, Brian, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here again.
Yeah, great. Well, hey, let's briefly talk just about your background. You know, I know you've got a ton of cybersecurity certifications, and you've been active in the Central Indiana and on a national level in audit for quite a while. So, can you share with the crowd a little bit more about what that's been like for you and your background?
Sure. So, close to 10 years ago now, I started my career path in audit after having taught at Ivy Tech for a while, become the program chair there for information technology services. Um, yeah, I first started off with financial services, and then over time, that was 20, I believe it was 2015 when the federal government first sort of made the mandate that the HIPAA security rule was going to be start being enforced. Up until that time, the security rule really hadn't been enforced. The privacy rule was the big thing everybody was concerned about, and so for the next couple of years, everybody was kind of getting up to speed as to what was going on in healthcare and how the security rules should be enforced and maintained. And in the course of that, one of the things that I discovered were that they were the first ones that I remember. I don't know that ISACA did this in their audit coursework, but I remember early on the HIPAA regulations called out specifically physical, technical, and administrative controls. And then they had subcategories in each of those as to what those controls consisted of, which I thought was really great because it helps you, it sort of gives you a framework to work from in terms of what you should be looking for, how to determine the effectiveness of controls, what a control even is. We spent a lot of time in that in ISACA circles, both in certification trainings and ongoing trainings. What are controls? How do you test them? Are they effective? How do you determine that effectiveness? And most importantly, what do you do when you find out they are not working the way that you had hoped?
Gotcha. Okay. One of the things that I think is that I've found useful, I guess, in my work over the years, is the labeling of not only whether it's an administrative, technical, or physical control, but also within some documentation. I believe it's NIST or maybe it's ISO. They talk about who's responsible for it.
Sure.
Whether or not it's technical, so then that goes to the technical side of the house, or whether or not I think it's the operational one, right? So it's a policy or process or something along those lines, and so then that gets tied into something that the business units oftentimes are responsible for. So, um,
The other,
so
th- the other, the other thing that I saw was this was more in financial services sector because it was required of banks of certain sizes. Actually, I believe it was required of all banks at the time when I finished this, that there's both an internal auditor. That person is responsible for maintaining those controls, testing them, implementation, et cetera. And so when I would go in and do an audit, oftentimes I worked very closely with the internal auditor because they didn't want to get mud on their face. But if I had questions about a particular control, about how it was implemented, when it was implemented, who's the owner, that's really what we're talking about, who's the owner of that control. So, it may be a password policy on Active Directory. In that case, it would be the administrators for the Active Directory environment. It changes as the organization gets larger. You see those responsibilities spread out. But at the end of the day, it's also, generally speaking, all falls under the responsibility of the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. In financial services, even if that's someone who's not specifically trained in cybersecurity specifically, they still hold that title. Someone in the banking institution has to be responsible for that. They have to be called the chief security officer. That person then, of course, reports to the board of directors. And after SOX came along back in the early 2000s, the directive came down from above that those directors on the board could no longer claim innocence because they, quote, didn't know what was going on, that no one reported to. It's their responsibility. So in financial services, there's a very clear chain of command. The owner of the control, the CISO or the internal auditor, then the CISO, and then the board of directors. And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask if you see that, or have you seen that changing over the last few years with regards to private sector organizations that maybe aren't necessarily tied to the financial sector?
Yeah, I'm not, unfortunately. In fact, just the
Okay.
opposite. My experience is that when we had this conversation a little while ago offline, private businesses don't like regulations. Banks don't like them either, but they don't have a choice. Private businesses don't like regulations. And without regulations, there's no authority to force you to do any of this stuff. This all has to come out of your own pocket. And most organizations won't do it unless they're forced to. It's just
Yeah.
that simple. It's cost of doing business, and they just don't want to spend the money on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I also think that, in my view, I think what I've seen across the industry is that maybe times are changing a little bit, and
Mhm.
regulations as they continue to kind of go up and down, with
Well,
whoever's in office. It really gets down to the point where businesses are going to be held more responsible by the public and by other organizations to make sure that they've got things in place, controls in
well, I
place.
think I think the other thing is it's financially driven. With the rapid increase in ransomware around the country in the private
Right.
sector, it all of a sudden becomes more cost effective to implement those controls than to if you've not been hit with ransomware. Businesses, and I'm making a generalization, but businesses tend to not want to spend the money and the resources on it. Once they've been hit, they get the wake up call, and then all of a sudden it's a top priority, and the heads start rolling.
Well,
So,
that's an interesting thing, and maybe we can do a show about that in the near future because it's almost what I'm hearing is that it's almost a self-regulated kind of a thing because if you don't do these controls or you do them in a minimalistic way, and ransomware comes for you, you may not be controlled from a regulatory standpoint, but from a business standpoint, that's going to cost you some. That's going to cost you some money.
yeah,
So
because there's training involved. Sometimes
yeah,
there's purchases of new hardware or software, and you have to train your staff to implement those changes. Yeah, and there's costs to go along with that. No, there's no question about that.
sure. Let's jump in, Brian, to the to some misconceptions. Some of the research that I put together on cybersecurity controls have these top 5 misconceptions about cybersecurity controls, and so I wanted to get your thoughts on these as we kind of work through this list because it's very important, I think, for organizations to understand that that just because you've got something there, right? You've got to actively manage it,
Right,
and that has a lot
right.
of components, and I think that's part of what this represents. So let's talk about the first one a little bit. So implementation of cybersecurity tools is enough to stay secure. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, not even close. Not even close. Yeah, buying a firewall and putting it on your network and configuring it once and leaving it alone is a really bad idea. Really bad idea. Those things have to be maintained, they have to be kept up to date. No different than your desktop or your server environments where things need to be watched very closely. There are manufacturer vendor releases, sometimes weekly, to prevent the bad guys, if you will, from getting access to your systems. And if you don't keep those up to date and in place, you're going to get hit.
What about the second one then? Once
Well,
implemented,
that's
controls don't
yeah,
need to
that's
be updated. It's kind of like the same thing. So,
yeah, more of the same thing is that they not only need regular updates, but they need to be watched. So, for instance, firewall policies, the most even semi-large private sector organizations, things change. You know, you have a new application, it requires ports to be open. How do you lock that down? Are you going to allow your administrators to work remotely? If so, how are you going to do that so that it's safe? Uh, excuse me, safely done. Are you going to let remote connections for employees to come in through that firewall to do their work remotely? And if so, how are you going to implement that? So there's constant changes. You know, we got clobbered with this during COVID. All of a sudden the workforce was completely mobile and
yeah,
everything had to be geared up and changed. It was a pretty dramatic. You can just open everything up, but you're also opening yourself up to get burnt really hard.
sure.
Don't want to do that.
But let me ask you with, small businesses, in that environment, when we look at maintaining, these controls, item number two, there's always been some discussion about, well, should a firewall, for example, should I be looking at the connections and the information on that on a regular basis? And so there's a lot of variables, I guess, with regards to what a regular basis is, or a lot of options. For some
Right.
organizations, it might be, daily, weekly, or whatever, and maybe somebody else that's monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually. What are
Well,
you thinking on that?
yeah, so for small businesses, my advice is to hire someone hire an external company that knows what they're doing. Check out their credentials, their staffing, find out what their reputation is like in the IT community, and hire someone to take care of that for you. Because if you're a small business, you're not going to be able to afford to hire someone full time, bring them in, train them, and do all that. They're going to wind up getting a job with another company because you've just trained them to go to work for somebody else. So find a company close to you that check it out thoroughly, do your due diligence, but find somebody else who can do that on a part-time basis because you don't need 24/7 uh, well, you need 24/7 support, but those things don't change hourly. They change daily and weekly sometimes, but very often not hourly. And so, having someone, a trusted vendor to work remotely can be a great value to you because they can then time slice between customers so that everybody gets very well taken care of with a higher level of expertise than what you'd be able to afford on your own.
Not to get too far off track, but I know you have a bit of a background in virtual CISO, uh,
Mhm, mhm.
activity or
Yeah,
service, and that might be something to consider. Maybe we could do a show about that at some
sure.
point. What it really takes to bring in somebody like that, and if you're a small, medium-sized what should you be looking at,
Right.
when you're hiring a virtual CISO?
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, but it's something
Yeah,
I think small businesses should look really hard at. I think it's a great option for them because you're not going to be able to hire people at the level they're expecting to be paid, and to do that full time. And there's a good chance you don't need that much full time support.
right.
A part time support person can take care of that for you.
Let's move on to item number three. Compliance equals security. That's been one of my mantras for some time. Is
Yeah.
that you get folks that are really zeroed in on just getting the basics in place, or maybe they're looking at implementing a broader, a higher level standard. But that's not necessarily. I mean, it's helping them some, but it's not really making them secure.
Yeah, we used to call this checkbox. checkbox security. Well, all my boxes are checked. Aren't I safe? Not necessarily. That's where a good risk assessment comes into play. You're going to find you can be completely compliant and still have humongous holes in your security system. That's where, like I said, a good risk assessment comes in, where someone comes in and actually takes a close colonoscopy, if you will, of your of your security systems and controls to determine whether they're effective controls to start with, and whether they're actually being effective, whether they're being implemented properly, are they being tested routinely, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. That kind of stuff.
Okay. Number 4, cybersecurity controls only protect against external threats.
Yeah, yeah, that's yeah. Uh, um, I can't talk too much about the FBI stuff that I was involved in, but the FBI is a good example in that, they have 85,000 plus employees across the United States and the rest of the world, and every single one of those is a single point of failure. So they're at a different level than a small business, but the point is that employees and or vendors are probably your weakest link in your security chain. Um, they're the ones who click on the ransomware links. They're the ones who do wire transfers mistakenly to the wrong people or to the wrong places. So internal security threats can actually be more devastating, especially if you've
Right.
spent all your time and energy and putting up this wall to protect yourself from the outside threat, and you forget about the internal. Um, I could give you an example of let's say this is not uncommon at all. Um, you buy another company. Okay, you're whatever size you are, and you gobble up a smaller company, and they're using an accounting package, and it's the same one you're using, and you think, oh, cool, well, you can just import all the data, right? But what you didn't do is a good risk assessment of their organization before you brought all that stuff in. And what you didn't know is that their controls are not the same as yours, and there are weaknesses in those, and you bring those in, and it allows someone to do something they shouldn't do because the permissions and controls on the application are not the same as the ones that you're used to expecting. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
very interesting point because
that's a
when organizations that do acquisitions, uh,
right,
it's just one of those things that there may be either no risk assessment or a cursory risk assessment,
right.
but when you
Even if
actually
it's
start to get the data and how the data
right,
is integrated, that's a different story. So,
even if it's cloud based, there are, for instance, in the auto industry, there are really only like two specific applications that car dealerships use for managing inventory, parts, service, the whole deal. There's these companies have come up over the last 20 years and developed these really robust packages. Well, let's say that you're a big car dealership and you're going to buy a smaller one, which happens all the time, right?
right.
And they're using the same package, but they set up the controls so that Mary can do whatever she wants to with the money because the boss completely trusts her. And you import all of that into your system, and now all of a sudden Mary's controls are mixed with yours. You don't know that because you didn't do a proper risk assessment before you brought all that stuff in. Next thing you know, someone in the organization has the opportunity to make a wire transfer, and there's no control in place to stop them from doing that.
Wow. Yeah,
Great example. Happens
it,
all the
it
time.
is. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool.
Stories from the FBI. No names. No
Let's
names or specifics.
let's see. So the last item on this list, strong passwords are all you need for access security.
Yeah,
So I know a lot
that's
of places that think this way.
yeah, it's about as much of a joke as compliance equals security. It's just not true. Strong passwords are actually not even a thing anymore. The software that's used to gain access to your systems sometimes use passwords, but oftentimes just uses links. It's easier to get an employee to click on a link than it is to try and crack passwords. If you can get them to click on a link and you do a man in the middle attack, problem solved. Simple case of that is, I'm a hacker and I send you a link in an email telling you that you need to click on this to update something in your bank account. You click on it and it takes you to a screenshot that looks just like your bank account. You put in your username and password and it goes, "Bah," sends you an error, says you made a mistake on your password. And you go, oh, okay. And you go back to the thing. Well, the password's already been captured. You didn't mistype it. It's been captured and you've been redirected to the original real site. And now you can go ahead and log in and look at stuff. But in the meantime, the bad guys have got your password. They wait till you're done and they go back into your account and change the password and then take all your money.
Yeah.
Happens all the time like that. Comes in text messages, comes in emails, all kinds of wild, crazy stuff.
Yeah. Folks just get a barrage of that stuff
Right,
anymore.
right,
And,
right.
it's, we talked before the show a little bit about, how email and even text messages and those kinds of things are, such a concern anymore. And one of the things that I've seen is just a migration towards portals, where organizations
Mhm.
that you're regularly interacting with have developed or implemented their own portal, and so controlling access to the portal, and then communications or whatever is tied into that. So that's a
I
trend for another show, but
give you another example of a financial institution where I won't mention names. Excuse me. I won't mention names, but this was a small community bank. They had financial audits done by a big four company for 10 years. And um, one of the bank executives did some digging because he saw something that didn't look right and brought the Secret Service in because you can do that in banking. You can bring in a Secret Service, you can bring in the state police, you can bring in FBI, whoever you want to do an investigation. And sure enough, they found that one of their employees, she didn't click on anything. She'd been embezzling money for the last 12 years, and she'd embezzled about $7 million out of consumers' bank accounts, little
wow.
bits at a time, out of hundreds of accounts. And the financial auditors didn't catch it. That's a classic insider threat that your security controls, unless properly monitored and evaluated for effectiveness, won't work. They had all the right controls in place. They had an employee who knew how to go around them.
Yeah.
So you have to have, you're going to hear me start talking about that's what routine audits are for. That's what routine control testing is for, so that you can make sure that those controls are in fact doing what they're supposed to do, and to stop those kinds of things from happening.
Sure. No, that's a great example. Well, let's talk.
She's in prison now, by the way.
I would think, yeah,
A
that's
long time.
a little bit more than just regular lunch money. So
Yeah.
for sure. Um, well,
But that happens all the time in nonprofits where they
sure,
don't have where they have money, but they don't really have, they're nonprofit. They're good people. They don't think of that anything like that's ever going to happen to them. And then they wake up one morning and someone's cleaned out their bank account.
right,
Yeah. Or politicians. They do the same thing.
okay,
I'll leave that one alone.
all right,
Go
yeah.
ahead. Go ahead. Go
Good.
ahead.
Well, hey, so let's talk about measure and control effectiveness.
Okay.
And so, when I've gone through and I've done some research on really what that means, I've come up with these 6 areas, and so I know that in our we were talking about this earlier, and you had a few things to add to this, and obviously this is not a complete list, but what it really does is in my view, getting a small business or even a medium-sized business to really look at some basics with regards to how they're going about implementing and measuring controls. I think that this is probably something that they could start with. And
Yeah. Well,
so
I was going
interested
to
in
say the oldest one in the book is, your password policy. Is it complex? Does it require special characters? How long is it? And how often do you have to change it? And so one of the things I would do as an auditor is, number one, I would go in and look at the Active Directory policy to make sure there was one, and that it followed what the policy said they should follow. If they didn't, that had to be corrected. But more importantly, I then did a random, or excuse me, I got my finger slapped for this one time. What's the term we used to use? It's not random because nothing's random. Um, a haphazard sampling. That's the term that accountants use. We used a haphazard sampling of accounts to find out whether or not there were accounts that didn't comply with that policy. And sure enough, you'd oftentimes find that one of the administrators overwrote the policy on their account, said, don't apply that to me. I don't want to have to change my password every 30 days. It's too complicated. Logging in and out of systems all the time. And you go in, you catch administrators doing stuff like this all the time. So you've got to have good audit practices in place to check the controls to see whether or not they are in fact being implemented. And then secondly, you've got to find out whether they're effective or not. So we used to argue for the longest time. Microsoft released this statement in 2005. For some reason, I don't know why they did it. They said that your passwords had to be a minimum of 7 or 8 characters. It was because of an old Windows 3.1 and Windows 95, 98 landman hack that would allow you to separate a password into 2 pieces and crack those 2 pieces because there were fewer characters. By going to 8 characters, you fixed it so you couldn't do that. Well, and it wasn't a matter of weeks before people had tools that would break those passwords. In fact, there are tools out there now that will generate billions, literally billions of password combinations. And with quantum computing and with high performance video cards, can grab a password file off an Active Directory server and crack those passwords in minutes. It's not even a big deal anymore.
Yeah, I remember that
So
landman issues. Well,
yeah. So having complex passwords by itself is not an effective control, and that's how you find out. As you go in and we did this up at there was a healthcare institution where we did exactly that. We put a 5 billion password file against their Active Directory and busted 10 of the administrators' accounts like that. Didn't take any time at all. So you've got to test the effectiveness of the control. Is it actually keeping people from gaining access to those passwords? And if not, then you've got to change it, which is, today we're looking at multi-factor authentication, and I don't say 2-factor, I say multi-factor, because it's going to get to the point where you're going to have to do 3 things. 2 isn't enough anymore. There's
yeah,
ways to get around that. Then you got to make sure your people are trained, not only on your employees are trained. Oh, I got to change my password every 30 or 60, 90 days, depending on the level of threat. That's where your risk assessment comes in, talking about what's the level of threat of this happening, or excuse me, that's not the word I want. What's the chance that particular event might occur? And if it's breeds high enough, then you're going to have to do something more. But again, you still have to test the effectiveness, because you can implement all day long. If it's not effective against the attacks, it's a crummy control. It needs to be updated or
sure.
changed.
Well, let me ask you this, Brian. So, when we're looking at controls, and we're trying to understand the effectiveness of it, you really have to have a goal and understand the goal
Right.
for
Right.
that control. And there's a lot of I think a lot of confusion, from a lot of folks, a lot of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, on how to actually understand what those measurements need to be. One of the things that I always heard a lot over the years is like, well, yeah, we're doing all this, but how do we really know when we're done? You know, and so
That's a real easy answer. Never.
I know. Yeah, go ahead.
When the bad guys stop, that's when you're done. That's the
Okay, well,
truth.
that's not the answer I thought you were going to give me, but
No, it's never going to end. I mean, there are people working 24/7 doing nothing but going through advanced degrees, learning how to take apart systems, learning how to fool people. Um, and we have to fight against that. And we don't spend 24/7 fighting against it. So we're on the weaker side of that equation at the moment.
oh.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, yeah. So we'll get to the answer that I thought you were going to give me here in a couple more discussions. But so here on the number 4, so does the control have the financial and technical resources to achieve the desired results? So understanding what those results are based on what the goals are,
Right.
that's one thing. But then making sure that the organization actually positions it or allows it to be successful, that's another discussion. Um, what,
That requires leadership support. From you and I had that conversation a little while ago. In my opinion, it requires leadership support from the top down. From the CEO all the way down, and the board of directors all the way down to the technician working on the keyboard. There has to be support for doing that, whether it be financial, technical, administrative, whatever. That support needs to be there. In fact, in financial services circles, those are required. There's a FFIEC regulation that says you must provide the financial resources needed in order to implement your security plan, because they'll ask you for a copy of your security plan. They're gonna want to read it. They're gonna go, there's a hole here, and there's a hole here, and there's a hole there. But we want to know, have you allocated resources to pay for a security officer, to pay for someone to do this? Do you have, if you're a small financial institution, are you outsourcing this to someone who's qualified, or did you just go with Billy Bob's brother? I used to run into that all the time with small community banks. Somebody had a relative who knew PCs, and that just didn't fly anymore. It just doesn't fly. You've got to have somebody with some expertise in there to be able to evaluate, to test, to evaluate, and give you good recommendations about how to improve your profile. But again, all of this really goes back to your risk assessment, Tom. Your risk assessment is going to tell you where you want to be, and here's where you're falling down. And so all of this ties very closely together with both your risk assessment and your audit work.
mhm. I know there's a lot of resources out there on risk assessments on how to conduct them, but I think it's probably something that we're going to take a deeper dive into,
Hmm.
and actually, uh, go through the process in a very detailed way about kind of what that really means. Because I've seen over the years where organizations will, take a deeper dive into risk, and maybe, the NIST special publication 837, the old, version one, that you get into like a lot of the nuts
Sure.
and bolts. But then, over the years, I've seen instances where it's more of a cursory risk assessment, and I think that does a lot of injustice to the organization because it's just not thorough enough.
Well,
So,
that's
but
just it.
every
I
check in the
think,
box, right? So,
yeah, exactly. It can't be a box check event. It needs to be. It needs to involve your staff. It needs to involve the board of directors. You need to have goals. What's the goal of the risk assessment? What is it you're trying to get your hand around that you feel like you don't have a good handle on at the moment? And where are your weaknesses? That's what it's really designed to do. It's a lot. It's very much like, in fact, I knew a banker gentleman one time who created this incredible heat map. He was an Excel wizard, and he created this incredible heat mapping for risk assessments based on what the bank thought was their primary risks. It was really quite interesting. I mean, it'd be nice to have a copy of that, but I think he's long retired. So that was 10,
sure.
15 years, 10, 15 years ago. He was getting retired then.
Okay. Uh, the next item number 5. So, are people trained? And I think that there's a lot of stuff associated with that. It's not only training on the actual control, uh, but also training on what to look for, how to
Right,
measure the control,
right.
uh, how to implement it. What have you seen in that regard?
Can you bring the slide back up again
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
for a second? Yeah. So that goes back to another discussion we had offline, which is as organizations get larger, especially with financial organizations, you'll find not only a chief security officer, but a chief audit officer or chief financial officer who's taken on the role of being the chief auditor. And it becomes those people's responsibilities to see to it that everyone involved in executing the control or in executing that control are trained properly. um, Oftentimes that's another problem, is you may have a control that's in place, but if people aren't trained properly on how to implement that, so you got a written policy that says we're gonna change our passwords every 30 or every 90 days in Active Directory, but you don't have someone trained on how to set that group policy up in Active Directory, you're going to have a problem. You got to be able to provide training for those folks and understanding what's the purpose of the control. Why are we doing this? This is not just something we're doing to hassle employees.
Sure.
And as we found, changing your passwords every 30 days really doesn't have much of an impact on security. In fact, there are a number of experts in the field who will say, don't ever change your password unless it's compromised.
Yeah, I have seen that trend in a lot of the NIST documentation. A lot of discussions I've had with organizations over the last, most recently, the last probably 3 or 4 years, about the strategy of not changing passwords and just using a higher level of MFA or these multiple factor types
Right,
of
right,
authenticators. So
right. Those are much more
I've
effective.
got kind of mixed feelings about that, but I guess we'll see how that works.
I think it's just that we're so conditioned to doing it. We've been doing it for so many years, that we're conditioned that we got to change our passwords all the time. And it's just not necessarily true.
Yeah. So the last item then is on this is how is success measured? So, I think there's a lot of things associated with that. What strikes you on this last box?
Well, again, having a good audit plan in place is one way to know. Can you bring the slide back up?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, please. That helps me. Yeah. So, if your policy is that your passwords should be changed every 90 days, then you check your logs to see whether or not that in fact has happened, because those events will be logged in Active Directory. And excuse me, um, uh, that's in my opinion, that's part of your audit plan. That makes sense.
It does make sense, yeah. And in our sessions earlier today, we talked about standards, and so we added this piece into the box. Uh, trying to understand and share information about standards can be tough because there's not, unless you're trained in information security, you may not understand what a standard is or why it's actually implemented. What resources over the years have you provided to folks to kind of help them understand that? Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in regulated industries, that's real easy. The regulators tell you what to use as your standards, and they'll actually test you on that. For small medium businesses, that's a really tough question to answer because they're all different. A car dealership's different from a mom and pop um, hairstylist organization. What really makes this tougher today is the fact that we've moved so much to the cloud and we rely on those cloud providers to provide all of that for us. In many instances, for example, I talked earlier about small medium businesses trying to find someone who's trained in the business of IT security to help them with this stuff. They've also got to find someone who understands cloud-based security, which is a whole nother ballgame.
Mm,
um,
right.
and um, measuring success there is very different than measuring success in your local. Standards come into play with that, um, mostly in the regulated industries. I think NIST has done a wonderful job with their cybersecurity framework, trying to build something that small medium businesses that are not regulated can use and implement without breaking the bank or without overtaxing their IT technology staff. The NIST cybersecurity framework is pretty straightforward. It can be implemented in both small, medium, and large organizations. You do not have to go with 800. I forget what the number is now.
Agree, yeah.
800,
Yep.
yeah, 823. You don't have to do that. You can use the NIST cybersecurity framework for everything from a small mom and pop shop all the way up. It provides you with all of those tools to do just that, to be able to design controls, create them, to implement them and to check to see whether or not they've been successful. So that's one of the things that's why I mentioned standards. I want to make sure people understood that those standards are there for a good reason. Now, you may meet the standard and still have an ineffective control. That's where you go back to the previous slide, if you would, for a second.
There we go.
Yeah, compliance equals security. That's a misconception. So go back to the second slide again, if you will. If you're implementing NIST Cybersecurity 2.0 and you've met all of those functions, that doesn't necessarily mean you're secure. There may still be things you need to do. For instance, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework doesn't mention having lights outside of your business or cameras, does it? Doesn't mention anything with regard to physical security like that. You and I both have a good friend, Chuck McCormick, who makes his living doing that for companies. He goes and designs lighting systems and camera systems for security purposes. So physical security oftentimes is completely overlooked with these standards, and yet still have a great deal to do with the security of your organization.
Yeah. I will put links to not only 853, but the cybersecurity framework in the show notes. So folks don't have a background in standards or understand that they can do that and go through and take a look at that. Well, one of the things that I've enjoyed over the years about NIST and the way they do their documentation, especially the 853 revisions, is that they've got those discussions in there.
Mhm,
And so,
mhm.
when you're going through and you're trying to figure out what a control means and how I'm going to apply it within an organization, you can not only look at the standard, read that, it'll tell you what the standard means, but then it'll give you a discussion about how to apply it. And I
Right,
think,
right.
that's something that I'm not sure a lot of individuals really take advantage of, but it's certainly in there and it's available. And all those NIST standards, I mean, they're free, right? So people
Right,
just have to
right.
know what to look for because it can be a bit overwhelming. But once they
Not only
understand
that,
what it is, they can dive in and chase it down.
yeah, not only that, but they also have ongoing discussions with their, uh, if you will, their beta versions of what they're developing. They'll send out email requests for feedback from clients who are using version 1.0 about what they don't like about it before 2.0 was released. And they'll do the same thing for 3.0. There'll be several years of discussions with people who have implemented the cybersecurity framework 2.0, and asking them for feedback. What did we miss? What don't you like? What do you like? That kinds of stuff. So they're constantly asking for feedback, begging for it actually, and trying to cull the model to accomplish what it is small businesses need and want. This is not something that a government organization is trying to shove down your throat. They could care less whether you ever implement it. They're trying to build something that you can find useful, that will help you implement it at minimal cost, which is why they're free. This is your government tax dollars at work. So yeah, I would strongly encourage people to take a look at those. Standards.
Yep. And if you're a small business owner, or a medium-sized business owner, and you haven't really taken standards seriously, take a few minutes to just glance over these standards and these two documents, because these are things that as a business, we have to be more accountable to our clients and ourselves to make sure that we're doing the things that we can do to
Right.
make sure that we're secure. And as most business leaders, I think, or most information technology people will tell you, it's not something that you can go through and implement overnight, but you need to have a plan. You need to have a strategy for longer term implementation and support, and prioritizing those control implementations is all based on risk. So, you mentioned already, Brian, a few times about risk assessments and making sure that those are done and people understand what those are. So, also put a note into the show notes about risk assessments. So, if you haven't done a risk assessment or you're not familiar with what that is, the cybersecurity framework will help with that. But I'll put a couple other resources in there
It,
too.
and yeah, on a last note, Tom, I'd like to say if you have a provider working with your company, an external provider, whether it's a consultant or someone who provides hands-on or whatever level that is. Find out whether or not they're comfortable with those standards. Do they understand them? Do they know what they're about? Can they help you implement them? Those are great questions to ask them. And if they don't give you adequate answers, maybe you need to think about finding another provider.
That's great information. So I think that's a show topic. You know what to ask your information technology provider.
Sure.
So we'll
Sure.
be jumping on that. Any other final thoughts, Brian?
No, I think that was the last one. I wanted to make sure people remember that they don't have to accept their lot. They can
Okay.
change it. They can change it, and it doesn't have to break the bank. There are plenty of ways to get the help that you need. I might put in one more plug. I don't have the link for it, but the state of Indiana on the cybersecurity the governor's cybersecurity task force that I was a member of for 8 years. Shatrice Romero did a wonderful job building a set of resources for local government organizations that you can find on the Indiana State website. You might want to find a link for that and put it on there too, in case you're listening and you're not a private sector business, but a public sector organization. Those tools are incredible. She just did an unbelievable job providing you free all of those tools. Again, that's your government tax dollars at work.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put that on for sure. So,
Okay.
well, thanks. That brings us to time. So thanks for tuning in to Passion and Hard Work, where we're working to empower information security professionals by providing information, actionable insights, and personal experiences to grow your strategy and your information security program. So if you found today's program insightful and helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have questions, please put them in the show notes and or the comments, and we'll get to them. So once again, on behalf of Brian and myself, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks, Tom. I'm